Every night, at exactly 10 p.m., my grandfather would disappear into the basement, locking the door behind him. No one in the family questioned it. He was a man of habits, quiet and reserved. But something about his secret ritual gnawed at me. What was he doing down there? Who was he whispering to when he thought no one was listening? One night, when he left the house in a hurry, I found the key to the basement. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. What I found left me breathless, a hidden room filled with old photographs, war medals, and a locked wooden box. When I finally opened it, I uncovered a heartbreaking truth that changed everything. I always knew my grandfather was a man of secrets. He was quiet, reserved, and carried a certain mystery about him that no one in the family ever questioned. We just accepted that he had his ways, rituals he followed, rooms he kept locked, and stories he never told. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered the night I followed him. It started with a feeling, a nagging curiosity that wouldn't let me rest. My grandfather, despite his age, moved with a sense of purpose every evening. Around 10 p.m., he would get up from his chair, glance around the house, as if making sure no one was watching, and disappear down the hallway. I had noticed it for years, but only recently did I feel compelled to find out where he went. So one night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, I crept out of my bed and followed him. His steps were careful but steady as he made his way to the basement door. I watched from behind the staircase, my heart pounding in my chest. He unlocked it with a key he always carried on a chain around his neck. I had never seen inside that basement, not once in my entire life. He disappeared inside, closing the door behind him. I hesitated only for a moment before creeping closer. The old wood creaked beneath my feet, and I held my breath. My fingers grazed the doorknob, cold and unyielding. It was locked. I felt a pang of frustration, but I wasn't ready to give up. I pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. Then the faint sound of shuffling. Something heavy being dragged. And then whispering. But he was alone. A chill ran down my spine. Who was he talking to? I stepped back, determined to find out. For the next 3 days, I watched him closely. Every night at the same time, he followed the same routine. And every night, I waited for an opportunity to sneak in. That chance came sooner than I expected. One evening, my grandfather left the house in a hurry, forgetting to take his coat. That was unusual for him. He never forgot anything. When I went to pick it up, I heard the familiar sound of metal jingling. The key. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed it. My pulse raced as I walked down the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. I reached the basement door and hesitated for only a moment before sliding the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. The door creaked open, revealing a dark staircase leading downward. The air was thick, carrying a strange scent of old paper and something I couldn't quite place. I took a shaky breath and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, flickering slightly. But what caught my attention wasn't the light. It was the walls, covered in photographs, maps, newspaper clippings, an entire history laid out before me. Letters stacked neatly on a desk, some so old that the ink had begun to fade. And in the center of it all, a small, locked wooden box. I moved closer, my fingers trailing over the papers. There were photos of my grandfather as a young man, standing with people I had never seen before. Some were in military uniforms, others in suits. Some had their faces scratched out. My stomach tightened. What was this? Then my eyes landed on an envelope with my name on it. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Slowly, carefully, I opened it and pulled out a single letter. If you're reading this, it means you finally followed me. I knew one day you would. My breath caught in my throat. There are things I have kept hidden, things I have never spoken about. Not because I didn't want to, but because some secrets are too heavy to share. I looked back at the locked box. My heart pounded as I searched the desk, finding a small silver key tucked under a book. With shaking hands, I fit it into the lock and turned it. The lid creaked open. Inside were medals, old, worn, and faded with time. Dog tags, a folded piece of fabric that looked like part of a uniform. And at the bottom, a photograph. It was my grandfather, standing next to a man who looked almost identical to him. A twin. I felt dizzy as I picked up the picture, staring at the two men. I had never heard of my grandfather having a brother. Not once in my entire life. I turned the photo over, and in faded ink, a single sentence was scrawled. For the one I lost, but never forgot. My mind reeled. Had he died? Had something happened during the war? I dug further, my hands shaking as I unfolded an old letter tucked beneath the medals. The words were smudged, but I could still make them out. Brother, if you ever find this, I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise. I didn't even realize I was crying until a tear splashed onto the letter. My grandfather had lost someone. Someone he had kept hidden from the world, carrying the weight of that grief for decades. And every night, when he disappeared into the basement, he wasn't just going through old memories. He was talking to his brother. The whispers, the long hours spent down here. It wasn't madness. It was love. A love so strong that even death couldn't silence it. I sat there for what felt like hours, absorbing it all. When I finally closed the box, I knew I could never look at my grandfather the same way again. I placed everything back exactly as I had found it. That night, when he returned home, I didn't say anything. But when he got up to go to the basement, I followed him. This time, I didn't hide. When he turned and saw me standing there, holding out the photo, his eyes filled with something I had never seen before, an emotion so raw and deep, it made my breath hitch. His hands trembled as he reached for it, his fingers barely grazing the edges, as if afraid that touching it too firmly might make it disappear. Where did you find this?" he whispered, his voice uneven, laced with something between disbelief and sorrow. "In the secret room," I said softly, watching as he slowly sank into the worn-out armchair beside him. His eyes remained locked on the faded photograph, tracing every detail of the smiling woman captured in time. For what felt like an eternity, he just stared. Then, with a deep breath, he finally spoke. "Her name was Margaret," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was my world once, and I lost her." The weight of his words settled between us, heavy and unspoken for decades. And in that moment, I knew I had just uncovered a story that had been buried for a lifetime. Relief. And for the first time in his life, he told me the truth.